For 73 years, the world watched Prince Philip stand one step behind the Queen, straight-backed, silent, correct. The men who dressed him each morning watched something else. They saw the temper and the tenderness, the exactness, the private man who ran a palace like a warship and never once let the public pass the door. There were only ever a handful of them across half a century, valets and pages and private secretaries, and every one of them signed away the right to speak. When he was buried at Windsor, 30 mourners were allowed inside the chapel, and not one of those servants was among them. They walked behind the coffin, and they stopped at the door. What they carried in silence. If you find yourself drawn to the stories that happen just out of frame, the ones a household keeps to itself, then subscribe and stay close. This one was kept quiet for a very long time. Chapter 1. The men sworn never to speak. In 1954, a valet did the one thing almost no one in Prince Philip's service would ever do again, and put what he saw into a book. His name was John Dean, and for several years he had dressed the young Duke of Edinburgh, cared for his uniforms and his medals, packed his cases, and moved through the private rooms of Buckingham Palace, Sandringham, and Balmoral at the hour when the public is never present. The book he wrote was called A Portrait of the Duke by his valet. It is a gentle thing, affectionate and protective, more the account of a man proud of his master than the account of a man with scores to settle. And that is exactly why it matters. In more than half a century of service, John Dean's warm little memoir would stand almost alone. The men who came after him, the ones who stood just as close, would write nothing at all. To understand the life of Prince Philip, it helps to begin not with the prince, but with the people who watched him. A royal household is a strange kind of country. It has its own borders and its own laws, its own ranks and its own silences. Around the Duke of Edinburgh, those ranks were filled by a small number of men who saw him at a range almost no one else was ever granted. There was the valet, who handled his body and his clothes, who knew the state of his health and the temper of his mornings. There was the page, who attended him hour to hour inside the residence, who carried and announced and served and stood near enough to hear everything. There was the equerry, a serving or former officer who stood at his shoulder on every public engagement and every journey. And there was the private secretary, the figure who ran the professional machine, the diary and the correspondence and the speeches, the chief of staff of a one-man institution. Between them, these men held the whole of his working and private life in their hands, and between them, they said almost nothing. The silence was not an accident. It was the culture of the place, and Philip's household kept it more completely than most. Royal servants signed away their right to speak as a condition of the work. There were understandings, and later there were agreements in writing that what happened inside the household stayed inside it. But the deeper binding was not a piece of paper. It was a system of reward. Loyalty was recognized over years and decades, with honors in the personal gift of the sovereign, a ladder of letters after the name that climbed in step with length of service and with discretion. To talk was to fall off that ladder and out of that country forever. To keep faith was to be honored, quietly, as one of the crown's own. And so, the pattern held. Where other great households leaked, gossiped, and in time produced their tell-all books, the Duke of Edinburgh's people simply closed the door and kept it closed. It helps to set his household beside another to see how unusual that silence was. In the same decades, a few hundred yards away at Clarence House, the Queen Mother kept a page named William Talon, known to the newspapers and eventually to the whole country as Backstairs Billy. Talon served the Queen Mother for more than 50 years, from the early 1950s until her death in the year 2002. And across that time, he became a public character in his own right, flamboyant, gossiped about, a figure of London legend, and the subject after his death of an entire biography. His world of below-stairs intrigue and personality was practically a stage. Nothing of the kind ever attached to Philip's men. Talon belongs in this story only as a contrast, a reminder of how loud a royal servant could become, set against how quiet Philip's chose to remain. The Duke's household was the disciplined extreme of that hidden world, buttoned, correct, and mute. John Dean's little book, for all its warmth, gives a rare glimpse of what that closeness actually looked like from the inside. A valet knew things no one else knew. He knew which shirts and which uniforms, the exact order of the medals, the small habits of dressing and undressing, the private moods of a man first thing in the morning before the public face went on. He travelled everywhere with his master, packed and unpacked in palace and castle and lodge, and stood, quite literally, closer to the body of the prince than anyone but his wife. Dean wrote of all this with affection and discretion, revealing the texture of the life while betraying none of its secrets, and in doing so he set the template that every servant after him would follow, except that they would leave out the book entirely. The intimacy was total. The disclosure was nil. That was the bargain of the household, and Dean's gentle memoir is the one place it was ever even partly written down. What they were being quiet about was a genuinely two-sided man, and the two sides could hardly have been further apart. In public, for 7 decades, Prince Philip was the model of ceremonial restraint, the consort who walked the correct pace behind his wife and never, or almost never, let the mask slip. In private, the household saw a man of formidable temper and exacting standards, a restless and technical mind that could not leave a system alone, a man who swore at photographers and reorganized kitchens and demanded that things be done properly and fast. And beneath the sharp edges, they saw something the public would have found harder to believe, a rough and genuine loyalty that ran in both directions, a fairness that bound men to him for 30 years at a stretch. The public knew the first man, only the servants knew the second. And the proof that the closeness was real, and not the invented intimacy of people who merely stood nearby, would come at the very end of his life, written into his will. When Prince Philip died, his estate, reported at around £30 million, made bequests to 3 of his personal staff. There was his last private secretary, the brigadier who had run his diary for the final decade. There was his page, and there was his valet. These were the men who had taken turns caring for him in his last years, at a farmhouse on the Sandringham estate, and at Windsor, through the long months of the pandemic. And he remembered every one of them by name. It was a plain and unmistakable act of downward loyalty from a man the world thought of as cold, an old sailor ordering his affairs and choosing, with his last stroke of the pen, to thank the people who had served him closest. And yet, on the day they buried him, not one of those 3 men was allowed inside the chapel. The funeral fell under the rules of the pandemic, and the number of mourners permitted through the doors of St. George's Chapel was capped at 30 places, and every one of them went to family. The servants who had dressed him and driven him and run his life walked in the procession behind the coffin in the cold spring air and stopped at the chapel door. They had watched him for a lifetime. They had been remembered in his death, and they were left standing outside the church. That is the shape of the whole story, held in a single image. A man of total exposure to a handful of people sworn to reveal nothing. A life watched at the closest possible range by witnesses who would carry what they saw to their own graves. What they saw never left the corridors. To follow Prince Philip properly, then, is to follow the Watchers, from the first valet who broke the silence gently in 1954, back to the very beginning, to a boy who learned before he could remember that the people who look after you are the only country you truly have. To find where that lesson was taught, the story has to go back almost 100 years to a villa on a Greek island and to a warship waiting offshore in the dark. Chapter 2. The boy carried out in a box. Before he had a household of his own, Philip was a child passed between other people's houses, stateless, often penniless, and taught early that the people who look after you are the people who matter. He was born on the 10th of June, 1921, on the island of Corfu, in a villa called Mon Repos, with no hot water and no electricity worth the name, the only son and fifth child of Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark and Princess Alice of Battenberg. He was born a prince of Greece and Denmark, and he was born, in the truest sense, into a family already falling. Within 18 months, the fall arrived. Greece had gone to war with Turkey and lost, and in the reckoning that followed a military revolt, swept away the government and turned on the royal family. Prince Andrew, Philip's father, a general who had commanded in the field, was arrested, court-martialed, and stood in real danger of being shot, as other senior figures of the old regime were shot. The intervention that saved his life came from Britain. King George V, alarmed at the fate of his relatives, sent a warship, and in December of 1922, the cruiser HMS Calypso carried the whole family away from Greece for good. The infant Philip went with them, and the detail that everyone remembers, the detail that has followed him through 100 obituaries, is that he was carried aboard and settled to sleep in a cot improvised from a fruit box. The exact object shifts from one telling to another, an orange box in some accounts, a packing crate in others, but the substance is not in doubt. The future consort of the British Crown left his birthplace as cargo in a wooden box on the deck of a foreign navy's ship before he was old enough to remember any of it. What followed was a childhood with no fixed ground beneath it. The family did not go home because there was no home to go to. They settled for a time on the edge of Paris, in a house lent by a wealthy relative, living on the generosity of others in the shabby, genteel way of exiled royalty, with a great name and very little money. There was no throne to return to, no fortune to fall back on, and before long, there was no settled family at all. His 4 elder sisters, all considerably older than him, married into German noble houses across the middle years of the 1920s and moved away into lives and countries of their own, so that the small boy was left more or less alone at the centre of a scattering family. His father drifted south to the warmth and the card tables of the French Riviera, to Monte Carlo, and slowly out of the boy's daily life altogether. And his mother, Princess Alice, who was born deaf and had learned to read lips in several languages, suffered a severe mental breakdown. She was diagnosed, removed from the family, and placed in a sanatorium in Switzerland. For years, in effect, the boy had no parents present at all. Picture the arithmetic of that childhood, because it explains almost everything that came after. He was born a prince and evacuated as a refugee before he was 2. Within a few short years, his mother was in an institution and his father was gone to the Riviera. His 4 sisters had married and moved into a Germany that was sliding towards dictatorship. He held a Greek and Danish royal title and had, in practical fact, no country, no settled home, and very little money. He spent his holidays wherever a bed could be found, with grandmothers and uncles and cousins, a permanent guest in other people's houses. A child assembled from other people's households would grow into a man who understood households from the inside. and who would one day build one of his own with the ruthless efficiency of a person who knew exactly what it was to lack one. It would be easy to make this sound only tragic, and in some ways it was. But the boy who came out of it was not broken. He was hardened, self-reliant, and watchful. A child who had learned that affection was not guaranteed, and that security came from competence and from the people who chose to look after you, rather than from any birthright. He learned to travel light, to make himself useful, to keep his own counsel and his own feelings well out of sight. The men who would one day serve him were, in a sense, foreshadowed in that childhood. Philip understood the value of a loyal household, of people who simply stayed and did their work and did not let you down, because he had spent his early life depending on exactly that and knowing how rare it was. His schooling followed the same restless map across the same borders. He was sent first to an American-run school in Paris, then across the Channel to Cheam, an English preparatory school from 1930. Then came the most formative move of all. He was sent to Germany, to a school called Salem, run by a remarkable educator named Kurt Hahn. Hahn was a German Jew whose whole theory of education was built on physical challenge, self-reliance, service to others, and a deliberate stripping away of comfort and self-pity. But Philip's time at Salem was short, because the world was darkening around it. Hahn, who had spoken out against the Nazis, was arrested when they came to power and then forced out of Germany altogether. He fled to Scotland, and there, on the wild and windswept Moray coast, he founded a new school called Gordonstown. And Philip, the half-German, half-Greek, wholly stateless boy, followed his teacher north to the edge of Scotland. Gordonstown in those years was Spartan to the point of severity, and it fitted him like a glove. There were cold showers before dawn and runs in the bitter North Sea wind. There was a curriculum built as much around seamanship, building, firefighting, and physical endurance as around books. For a boy who already trusted hardness more than tenderness, who had learned to expect nothing and rely on himself, it was less a hardship than a homecoming. He thrived. He grew into a tall, fair, confident young man, good with his hands, better still on the water, impatient with softness in himself and in everyone around him. The values Gordonstown drilled into him, self-discipline, service over comfort, no complaint and no self-pity, are the values his household staff would spend 50 years absorbing at second hand. When people later described the Duke of Edinburgh as a man who could not abide fuss, who wanted things done properly and done without whining, they were describing a personality shaped on a cold Scottish shore by a refugee schoolmaster who had lost his own country too. By the late 1930s, the shape of the man was set. He was clever, restless, physically fearless, emotionally guarded, and formidably self-contained. He had learned to give his loyalty to institutions and to individuals who earned it, rather than to a family that had come apart. And he had found, in the sea and in the discipline of ships, the one world that felt like solid ground beneath his feet. When the time came to choose a path, there was really only one he wanted. He would go into the Royal Navy, and it was there, in the war that was about to break over Europe, that the exactitude which would one day rule a palace was forged in something far more serious than ceremony, in gunfire, in darkness, and in the deaths of other men. Chapter 3. The Searchlights at Matapan. At 20, on a battleship in the dark off the coast of Greece, Philip found the discipline that would govern every household he ever ran. He had entered the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth in 1939, in the last months of peace, and he had graduated at the very top of his term, marked out at once as one of the ablest cadets of his year. He was, by every account, a natural naval officer, quick, capable, physically brave, and notably cool under pressure, Exactly the kind of young man the service watches and grooms for high command. And then the war arrived and gave him the chance to prove it in the most literal way imaginable, off the coast of the country he had been carried out of as a baby. In the spring of 1941, he was a midshipman aboard the battleship HMS Valiant in the Mediterranean Fleet. On the nights of the 28th and 29th of March, that fleet met the Italian Navy off Cape Matapan, at the southern tip of Greece, in one of the most complete British victories of the entire naval war. Philip's station that night was the searchlights. In the darkness, as the fleets closed to point-blank range, it was his job to hold the beams steady and true on the enemy cruisers, to pin them in the light so that the British guns could find them and destroy them. He did it. The beams held, the guns fired, and 2 Italian heavy cruisers were sunk in minutes. His commanding officer's report on the action is a document worth quoting in full, because it is the earliest official assessment of the man from someone who had watched him work under fire. Thanks to his alertness and appreciation of the situation, it read, the ship was able to sink in 5 minutes, 2 Italian cruisers of 8-inch gun. For his part in the battle, he was mentioned in dispatches, one of the highest recognitions a junior officer could receive, and the Greek state, the country that had exiled his family, awarded him its War Cross of Valor. He was 19 years old. The war made him fast, and it made him serious. By the age of 21, he was first lieutenant of the destroyer HMS Wallace, second in command of a fighting ship in home waters, one of the youngest officers to hold such a post anywhere in the Royal Navy. During the Allied invasion of Sicily in 1943, with the Wallace under night attack from the air and no way to shoot her way clear, he is credited with a piece of quick thinking that very likely saved her and her crew. He had a raft built and set adrift on the dark water, loaded with smoke floats, so that when it was launched and lit, it made a burning smudge on the sea that drew the enemy bombers away from the ship towards a decoy. The bombers went for the raft. The ship slipped away into the night and survived. It is a small story, but it is the essential one, and it is worth holding on to because the same instinct appears again and again across his whole life. Faced with a lethal problem in the dark, he did not panic, and he did not wait for orders. He built a practical device and solved it. That instinct, to look hard at a system under stress and engineer a way through it, never left him. Not on a destroyer, not on a carriage course, not in a palace kitchen. He ended the war aboard the destroyer HMS Whelp, and he was there, in Tokyo Bay, when the Japanese surrendered in the autumn of 1945, and the guns of the greatest war in history finally fell silent. What the Navy gave him was not only a profession, it gave him a whole philosophy of how the world should work, and it is impossible to make sense of the man his staff would later serve without grasping it. A warship is the purest possible expression of the values Gordonstown had planted in him. Everything aboard a ship has a place and a purpose. Time is kept to the minute. Standards are not a matter of taste, but of survival, because at sea, sloppiness kills men. A thing is done properly, or it is done again until it is right. Rank is clear, duty is clear, and sentiment is a luxury the sea does not permit. Philip took to this world completely, gratefully, because it was the first environment of his whole life that rewarded exactly the qualities he had built in himself to survive his childhood. He was, by the assessment of those above him, an officer of unusual promise. And there is a persistent view in naval circles, attributed to senior figures who knew and watched him, that had his life run a different course he might have climbed to the very summit of the service, to First Sea Lord, the professional head of the whole Royal Navy. It must be said plainly that this is an opinion and not a fact, a judgment of what might have been. But it was the settled judgment of men who knew the service, and it tells you how highly he was rated. In 1950, Still only in his late 20s, that promise took its natural next step. He was given his own command, the frigate HMS Magpie. To captain your own ship in your 20s is the private ambition of every young naval officer, and he had reached it early. Those who served under him on the Magpie remembered a hard-driving captain who pushed the ship and her company to a high standard and expected a great deal from everyone aboard, himself first of all. The crew, by the accounts that survive, took a fierce pride in her. He drove them, and they rose to it, and the whole small world of the Magpie ran the way he believed a world should run, tight, capable, and fast. He was living the life he had chosen, on the solid ground of a career built entirely on his own merit and nothing he had inherited. And he was, by every sign, completely happy in it. Here, then, is the measure of what he had made of himself by the age of 30, and it is worth setting the whole of it down at once, because the contrast with what came next is the engine of everything that followed. A stateless boy carried out of Greece in a wooden box had become a decorated war hero, mentioned in dispatches at 19, honoured by a foreign government for valour, first lieutenant of a destroyer at 21, credited with saving his ship at Sicily, and the captain of his own vessel before he was 30, marked by his superiors as a potential future leader of the entire Royal Navy. He had built, from nothing, a self and a standing and a competence that belonged to him and to no one else. No family had handed it to him, for his family had scattered. No throne had provided it, for his throne was gone. He had earned every stripe on his sleeve with his own courage and his own work, and that is precisely why the years just ahead of him would be so hard. Because the life he had made for himself, the one solid thing he had ever built with his own hands, was about to be taken away from him by a marriage, a crown, and a role that no amount of courage or seamanship could ever teach a man how to perform. The searchlights at Matapan had shown a young officer exactly what he was capable of when everything depended on him. The years ahead would test something else entirely, whether a man forged to command could bear to spend the rest of his life standing, correct, and silent, one careful step behind somebody else. Chapter 4. The Prince with no country and no job. He married the future queen with almost nothing of his own, and within 5 years the navy he loved had been taken from him for good. He had met Princess Elizabeth before the war, a distant cousin, and through the long years of the war they had written to one another. She had, by every account, fallen for him early and firmly, and she held to that choice against a certain amount of quiet resistance from courtiers and relatives who thought the penniless, foreign, blunt-spoken naval officer an unsuitable match for the heir to the throne. He had the wrong sort of relatives, the German brothers-in-law. He had the wrong sort of manner for the stuffier corners of the court, too direct, too sharp, too much the outsider. None of it moved her in the slightest. She wanted him, and in the end, she got him. They were married on the 20th of November, 1947, at Westminster Abbey, in a Britain still grey, rationed, and exhausted from the war, a wedding that gave a tired country a day of colour and celebration. The day before the wedding, the great machinery of his transformation turned over. He gave up his Greek and Danish royal titles. He took, from his mother's family, the plain British surname Mountbatten. He was received into the Church of England, and he was granted the style of Royal Highness and created Duke of Edinburgh, Earl of Merioneth, and Baron Greenwich. In the space of a single day, he was remade, from a foreign prince of a fallen house into a British duke, the husband of the woman who would one day be queen. What he brought to the marriage in worldly terms was almost nothing at all. No fortune, no estate, no country of his own, not even, any longer, the titles he had been born with. What he brought was himself, his ability, his war record, and, for a few more precious years, his career. Because at first, the naval life continued, and those were, by his own later admission, among the happiest years of his whole existence. He was posted to Malta, where the Mediterranean fleet was based, and there, for a time, the two of them lived something close to an ordinary life. Elizabeth was simply a naval officer's wife on a warm and sociable island, living an ordinary sort of life of a kind she would never know again. And Philip was a serving officer with a real future in the service and a ship to think about. It was in Malta, in 1950, that he was given command of the Magpie. For a brief and golden window, the two halves of his life held together in balance. He was a husband and a father, for their first children came in these years, and he was a captain, and the great crushing weight of the crown was still, as far as anyone outside the innermost circle knew, a long way off in the future, resting on the shoulders of the king. But the king was not well, and the shadow that had always been there began, quietly, to lengthen. George VI had never expected to be king at all. He had come to the throne only because his elder brother had abdicated, and the strain of the role and the strain of the war had aged and weakened him, and now his health was failing far faster than the public was allowed to know. And so the balance of Philip's life began to tip. He gave up active command of the Magpie in 1951. The couple returned to Britain and to a steadily heavier load of public duties. The naval future receded, and it was in exactly these years, as the household of the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh took its first proper shape, that the most important of all the witnesses walked into the story. His name was Michael Parker. He was an Australian, born in Melbourne in 1920, a naval officer who had met Philip in 1942, when both were young men commanding small escort ships in the cold and dangerous northern seas, shepherding convoys through waters thick with submarines. The friendship had been forged before Philip was anything but a junior officer, between equals, in the shared danger and boredom and black humour of the war at sea, and that origin mattered enormously. Parker was not a courtier who had smoothly attached himself to a rising prince. He was a friend from the lower decks of Philip's own life, worldly, funny, loyal, and entirely without side or grandeur. After the wedding, he joined the household, first as equerry, and then, as the reign drew near, as private secretary. He ran the office, organised the diary, arranged the tours, smoothed the path, and stood at Philip's shoulder through the whole of the early reign that was about to begin. Of all the men who would watch Prince Philip across the length of his life, none stood closer in those first years than the cheerful Australian, and none, in the end, would fall further. It is worth measuring the household that was forming around them, because it tells you exactly what kind of institution Philip was being folded into, and against his will. This was not a private couple with a housekeeper and a cook. This was the beginning of a court in miniature, a professional apparatus of private secretaries and equerries and valets and pages and clerks, an office that would in time process an almost unimaginable volume of public life. Set down the scale of what that machine would eventually do, because the numbers are staggering. Across the years of the reign that lay ahead, Philip alone would carry out more than 22,000 solo public engagements. He would make over 600 solo overseas visits to 67 Commonwealth countries and dozens more beyond them. He would deliver something close to 5,500 speeches. He would serve as patron or president or member of more than 780 separate organizations. He would write 14 books. Every single one of those figures represents work that a household had to plan, arrange, staff, travel, and clear up after. The handful of men gathering around him in the early 1950s were the first crew of that vast machine. and Michael Parker was its first captain. Those Malta years meant something to him that nothing in the long life afterward ever quite matched, because they were the last time he was ever truly free. On that sunlit island, he was a serving officer among other serving officers, judged on his seamanship and nothing else, living in a rented house, driving his own car, dining in the mess, taking his ship to sea. His wife was there as a wife, not yet as a sovereign. No one bowed to him as a matter of course. He was, for a few short years, simply Lieutenant Commander Mountbatten of the Royal Navy, a good officer with a bright future, and by every account he was never happier before or since. The staff who served him in all the decades afterward were serving a man who had once known real freedom and had lost it, and who never entirely stopped grieving for it. That grief, quiet and unspoken, was part of what they lived alongside every day. And Philip, for the moment, still had one foot in the other world, the world of the sea, where he was his own man on his own bridge. He did not yet know how little of it was left. The king's illness moved faster than anyone outside the innermost circle understood. In the early days of February 1952, the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh set out on a long overseas tour, flying first to Kenya, standing in for the ailing king on a journey he was too weak to make himself. They broke the journey at a remote lodge in the Kenyan bush, a place built high in the branches of a great fig tree to watch the wildlife come to the waterhole below. And it was there, in that lodge, that the news reached them. The king had died in the night. In a single morning, on the far side of the world, the young woman asleep in the treehouse became queen of a quarter of the earth, and the last of Philip's own life fell quietly away. The role he had never been trained for, and could never in his life resign from, closed over him for good. Chapter 5. A role that came with no instructions. When his wife became queen, Philip lost the one life he had built for himself, and was handed a position that no one could tell him how to do. The news from Sandringham, where the king had died in his sleep in the early hours of the 6th of February 1952, reached Kenya in a scramble of telegrams and telephone calls. It fell to Michael Parker, the private secretary and friend, to take the first confirmation, and then to find Philip, and then to leave it to Philip himself to walk his wife out into the grounds of the lodge and tell her that her father was dead and that she was now queen. Those who were near said that Philip looked, in that hour, as though the whole world had physically dropped onto his shoulders, and in a sense, it had. The young woman beside him was queen, and he, at a stroke, was the consort, a role with a magnificent title, a permanent place at the very centre of national life, and no defined duties whatsoever. The blow to him personally was immediate and severe, and it went far beyond grief for a father-in-law he had liked. His naval career was over, finished, in that same moment. There could be no question of a serving officer taking a ship to sea while his wife reigned as queen. He was promoted to commander later that year, but it was a courtesy, a rank on paper, and he never again served at sea or held a command. The one solid thing he had ever built for himself, the career earned stripe by stripe from midshipman to captain, was simply taken away and folded into the past, and he was only 30 years old. Many years later, asked about it directly with the bluntness that was his lifelong habit, he did not pretend it had been easy. He said, quite simply, that he would much rather have stayed in the Navy. It was not a complaint, exactly. It was a fact, stated the way he stated all facts, flatly and without self-pity. But it sat underneath everything he did for the next 70 years, a grief he never quite put down. Worse than the loss of the Navy in those first raw years was the sheer emptiness of what had replaced it. A consort has no constitutional function whatsoever. The Queen reigns. The government governs, the consort supports, and beyond that word there is nothing written down, no job, no department, no defined task from one end of the year to the other. Philip had a chair at the very heart of the kingdom, and, at first, almost nothing to do while sitting in it. He described the vacuum himself, later, in words that are almost painful in their plainness. There was no precedent, he said. If he asked anybody what they expected him to do, they all simply looked blank. Hold that picture for a moment, because it is the hinge of his whole life. A man of 30, a decorated war hero used to command and to purpose, a man who had measured his own worth entirely by competence and usefulness since he was a boy with no country, set down in a gilded and powerless role and told, in effect, to stand quietly to one side, to walk 2 paces behind, and to wave. For a personality like his, forged in exactly the opposite of idleness, it was very close to a sentence. There was a further sting in it that the public rarely appreciated. Even the family name became a battleground. Philip had assumed, not unreasonably, that his children would carry his name, Mountbatten, as children ordinarily carry their father's name. He was overruled. The Queen, on the advice of her ministers and her grandmother's generation of courtiers, confirmed that the royal house would remain the House of Windsor, and that the children would be Windsors. Philip is reported to have protested, with real bitterness, that he was the only man in the country not allowed to give his own name to his own children, that he was nothing but an amoeba. It was a small thing beside the loss of his career, and yet it was of a piece with it. He had given up his titles, his religion, his name, his country, and now his career, and even his fatherhood in the ordinary sense. All of it surrendered to the institution his wife embodied. The stateless boy had ended up in the middle of the greatest palace in the land, once again with nothing that was truly his own. He did not accept the emptiness. What he did instead, over the years that followed, defined the rest of his life and shaped the daily existence of every man and woman who worked for him. Denied a role, he went looking for one, and he seized the single territory that was actually available to him, the running of the royal households and estates. If he could not command a ship, then by God he would command this. He would take the sprawling, antique, gloriously inefficient domestic world of the monarchy, and he would make it work the way a well-run vessel worked, to standard, to time, without waste. It was the only outlet available for his enormous, dammed-up energy, and he threw the entire force of himself into it. The staff of those early years saw the struggle at close range, though they never spoke of it. They saw a young, vigorous, intelligent man, a decorated officer accustomed to command, chafing inside a role that gave him nothing to command at all. They saw the frustration come out sometimes as temper, as impatience with the slow and pointless ways of the old court, as a barely concealed restlessness in a man built for action and hemmed into ceremony. And they saw him, gradually, master it, or at least harness it, turning the frustration outward into work rather than letting it curdle inward into bitterness. It was, in its way, an act of enormous self-discipline, the same discipline that had carried him through a childhood with no ground beneath it, and a war that could have killed him a dozen times. He would not sulk in his gilded cage. He would find something to do, and he would do it to a standard, and the household would help him do it. The estates came first, and here the record is concrete and countable. Within the year of the accession, he was handed real executive responsibility for the royal lands. He took overall charge of the Sandringham estate in Norfolk in 1952. He was made Ranger of Windsor Great Park in the same year. He took a lifelong and detailed interest in Balmoral in Scotland. And these were not honorary titles that he wore to dinner and otherwise ignored. He worked them hard for decades, and the results could be counted up. At Sandringham, he oversaw the planting of more than 5,000 trees every year and the creation of over 100 miles of margins along the fields for wildlife. At Balmoral, he drove through a hydroelectric scheme able to generate 2 megawatts of power from falling water, and a long program of forest regeneration that expanded the enclosed woodland from 20 hectares in the 1970s to 300 hectares by 1992. At Windsor, he opened a farm shop to sell the estate's own produce to the public. A man who had been denied a purpose had gone out and dug one for himself in the soil, and it held. There was one more creation of these years that would outlast everything else, and it grew straight out of his own boyhood. In 1956, working with his old schoolmaster Kurt Hahn and with a distinguished mountaineer, Philip founded a scheme to challenge and develop young people through service, skill, physical endeavour, and expedition. He called it, simply, the Duke of Edinburgh's Award. It would go on to touch the lives of millions of young people across the world, and it remains his most enduring institutional legacy, a direct transplant of the cold showers and the endurance runs of Gordonstown into a programme any young person could take up. The man with no defined job had, within 4 years of losing his career, built an estate management operation, begun the reform of a royal court, and founded a youth movement that would carry his name for generations. The emptiness had been real. His answer to it was to fill it, relentlessly, with work. And the hardest and most personal of all that work, the work the household would feel most sharply, was the remaking of the palace itself. Chapter 6. The Man Who Timed the Palace. The new husband walked the corridors of Buckingham Palace with the eye of a ship's officer, and the old court did not forgive him for it. To Philip, the palace as he found it in the early 1950s was an affront to everything the Navy had taught him about how a well-ordered world should run. Here was a great and famous institution operating almost entirely on habit rather than reason, employing whole regiments of people to do simple things in the most elaborate and roundabout way conceivable, for no better reason than that they had always been done that way. To a man who had built a burning raft to save a destroyer, who kept time to the minute and standards to the letter, this was very close to intolerable. And so, methodically, patiently, and with a total disregard for the feelings of the people whose traditions he was trampling, he began to take the household apart and put it back together in better order. The story that has come to stand for all of it is the story of the telephones. In the palace as he found it, messages between rooms and departments were in many cases carried by hand, by footmen, who walked physically from one part of the enormous building to another, bearing a note or a spoken instruction, exactly as servants had done a century before. Philip wanted telephones installed, so that a person in one office could simply speak to a person in another and be done in a moment. There was resistance, and the resistance, by the accounts that survive, came in part from the Queen Mother's corner of the household, where the older way, the human way, of a servant carrying a message on a silver salver was felt to be more dignified and more proper. Philip won. The telephones went in. It is a small thing, and it is also the whole man in miniature. He looked at a system, saw the waste buried in it, and replaced it with something that worked, entirely regardless of whose sense of tradition he happened to tread on in the process. The telephones were only the opening move. He was, by the reckoning of those who chronicled the court, the first member of the royal family to use a computer in his own palace office, at a time when such machines were rare, expensive, and regarded with deep suspicion by people who had run the place with pen and ink and footmen all their lives. He turned the same restless, reforming eye on the way the monarchy showed itself to the country, And here his instincts, though bitterly resisted at the time, would prove decisive for the survival of the institution. He was the driving force behind the decision to allow the coronation of 1953 to be televised live. Over the horror of an establishment that feared the cold eye of the camera would strip the sacred mystery from the most solemn ceremony in the land. He was proved right. He persuaded the Queen to allow her Christmas message to be broadcast on television for the first time. He gave the first ever television interview by a member of the royal family, and, most strikingly and most controversially of all, he was the force behind a landmark documentary in 1969 that took cameras inside the family's ordinary daily life for the first time. That decision has been argued over ever since, and Philip himself came to have doubts about it, but the instinct behind it was unmistakably his. That an institution which hides completely will in the end be resented and discarded, and that to survive the modern age, the monarchy had to be seen. He even swept away the ancient ritual by which young upper-class women were formally presented to the sovereign at court as debutantes, judging it a snobbish absurdity. And he broadened the palace garden parties to admit a far wider slice of the country than the aristocracy alone. Not everyone approved, and the disapproval is well recorded by the people who studied the court from close up. One leading royal biographer put it plainly. When Elizabeth became queen, she said, Philip saw that the household was run in a very inefficient way, and being an extremely efficient man himself, he began to make quite sweeping changes to make it run better. And that, she added, is what made him a little bit unpopular with the old guard. A former press secretary to the Queen described the same drive from the inside, saying that Philip wanted to make the royal household and the monarchy less stuffy, to take away some of the endless, suffocating formality that clung to everything. The principle beneath all of it, the single fixed star that governed his whole conduct across 70 years, he stated himself, without decoration. His duty, he said, was to support his wife as monarch, and from that one position he never once wavered. Every reform, every impatience, every timing of the corridors and reordering of the kitchens flowed from that single unmovable point. For the staff, this restless, reforming energy was the very texture of daily life under the Duke of Edinburgh, and it was not always comfortable. They lived inside his measurements. He noticed things all the time. He wanted things done properly, promptly, and without fuss. And he was entirely capable of letting a person know, in a few short and memorable words, when they had not been. Some of the vivid stories that attached to this period, the reorganized kitchens so that hot food arrived hot rather than lukewarm after its long march through the corridors, the cutting of the elaborate relays of footmen, the introduction of modern appliances into a Victorian domestic world, are told and retold in the biographies as illustrations of the same relentless efficiency. It is fair to say that not every one of those specific stories can be traced to a firm source, and some have doubtless grown in the telling. But the direction of the whole is not in any doubt. He drove operational change through an institution that had never asked for it and did not want it, and he trod on the toes of a great many traditional courtiers in the doing. Set down the scale of the machine he was reforming, because it gives the reform its true weight. The occupied royal palaces would in later years employ around 500 full-time staff. Buckingham Palace alone holds 775 rooms, of which nearly 200 are bedrooms for staff. Into that vast domestic engine, older than living memory and set in its ways, Philip poured his officers' discipline for decade after decade, and the engine, driven that way, produced work on a scale worth stating outright, because it is the concrete measure of what the reformed household actually achieved. Over the course of the reign, He personally undertook more than 22,000 solo engagements. He made over 600 solo journeys abroad. He gave close to 5,500 speeches. He served more than 780 organizations as patron, president, or member. He wrote 14 books. He answered his own letters, and in old age, his own emails. Every part of that immense output rested on the household he had reformed, staffed, and driven to his own exacting standard. He had been given no job at all. He had built himself, out of nothing but frustrated energy and an officer's eye, the largest working life of any consort in the entire history of the British Crown. But the very same qualities that made him so formidable at the head of that machine, the sharpness, the impatience, the flat refusal to suffer fools or waste, had another face entirely. And it was the face the staff saw when the public cameras were switched off and the doors were closed. The man who reformed the palace was also the man who terrified new footmen and swore at photographers. To know the person the household actually served, and to understand the silence they kept about him, the story has to look squarely and without flinching at the temper. Chapter 7. The temper behind the door. The public saw a man of perfect ceremonial restraint, and the household saw the other man, the one who did not suffer fools and rarely troubled to hide it. Prince Philip's temper is, paradoxically, one of the best documented things about him, not because his own personal staff ever talked, for they did not, but because the biographers and the handful of insiders who did speak were strikingly consistent about it across the decades. He could be, in the words of one writer who knew him personally for the better part of 40 years, sullen and crabby for no reason that anyone present could detect, cantankerous and tetchy. Ask him a question he did not care for, this writer recalled, and you might get a snort, a snub, or a sudden merry laugh, with absolutely no way of predicting in advance which of the three was coming. He would walk away from conversations that bored him, mid-sentence, without a word of apology, a habit that another biographer called disconcerting in the extreme. And he described himself, with the gruff accuracy he applied to everything else, as a cantankerous old man, and worse. This was the exactitude of the warship turned on the human beings around him. A ship's officer who has watched carelessness get men killed does not easily learn to tolerate carelessness in peacetime, and Philip never did learn it. He wanted competence, precision, and speed, and when he did not get them, his displeasure was immediate, visible, and entirely undisguised. The writer who knew him best recalled being heckled by the Duke from the audience during his own charity speeches, cut off with a bark of, "Get on with it," or "We have heard this story before," or "What on earth is he going on about now?" It was, this friend said, the banter of a bully, delivered by a man who could then, a moment later, be the most charming person in the room. The staff learned to read the daily weather of him, to know which mornings were bright and which were black, to stand ready and to stay well out of the path of the storm on the days when the storm was up. It was a demanding thing, to be always calibrated to another man's mood. It was also, in its way, a skill, and the people who mastered it stayed for 30 years. Occasionally, the private bluntness leaked out into public view, and when it did, it made headlines everywhere, precisely because it sat so jarringly against the ceremonial mask the public was used to. He had a lifelong habit of saying the wrong, sharp, unfiltered thing, and he knew it perfectly well. He once described his own condition, wryly, as the science of opening your mouth and putting your foot in it, a science, he said, that he had practiced for many years. The most infamous instance of the temper itself came late in his life. At a lunch marking the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Britain, surrounded by photographers and thoroughly out of patience with the fuss of arranging a group picture, He snapped at one of them to just take the something picture. The something being a short and pungent word not usually heard from a member of the royal family in front of a bank of cameras. It ran around the world within the hour. A press photographer who had worked with the family for years said flatly and on the record that the Duke of Edinburgh was his least favourite royal to work with. The man who could not abide fuss found the whole machinery of modern celebrity, the endless photographs, the manufactured smiles, close to unbearable, and he did not always trouble himself to pretend otherwise. And yet, and this is the part that matters most for the people who actually served him, the temper is only ever half the portrait, and taken on its own. It is a lie. Because the most striking single thing about the testimony of those who worked around Prince Philip is not that they feared him, it is that they loved him. A former royal butler who watched the Duke at close range across many years put the paradox into words as well as anyone ever has. He was blunt, the butler said. He was not everyone's cup of tea. People were a little nervous of him. And then, without a pause, the same man said that he adored Prince Philip, that he liked precisely the fact that the Duke did not suffer fools and would always speak his mind. If he swore at you, the butler said, that was you getting to see the real man, and a great many people rather liked it. There it is, the strange alchemy at the heart of the household. The sharpness was not cruelty. It was directness, honesty without a coat of polish. And to the people who worked hard and did their jobs well, that directness from a man like Philip felt not like an insult, but like respect. The same impression of a man sharp on the surface and respected underneath comes back again and again from the different worlds he moved through. In the world of carriage driving, where he spent decades and where the people around him were horsemen and craftsmen rather than courtiers, the verdicts were the same. One judge of the sport remembered him as very likeable, a man who plainly did not tolerate fools. His own coachman, who worked beside him for 20 years, said simply that he was one hell of a man. A harness maker recalled a very technical mind that wanted to understand every part of the equipment. The words are almost interchangeable with the words of the butler and the biographers, and they come from people who had no reason to flatter a prince, and every reason, as practical working people, to resent an amateur who got in the way. They did not resent him. They rated him. He earned, in every world he entered, the respect of the people who actually knew the work. He was, in the phrase that best fits the whole weight of the evidence, hard but fair, and the fairness was every bit as real as the temper. The same butler recalled Philip's utter contempt for pointless bureaucracy and ceremony for its own sake. Told once that the household was a very large organisation and that things therefore had to be done in a certain slow and cumbersome way, the Duke's entire reply was a single word: why? It is a small word, and it holds his whole philosophy of life inside it. He asked why of everything, and he had no patience at all for the answer that a thing was done simply because it had always been done. That relentless questioning was, no doubt, exhausting to serve under. It was also, for the right kind of person, genuinely exhilarating, because you always knew exactly where you stood. He would not flatter you, and he would not deceive you, and if he came to trust you, he let you in close and kept you there for decades. The private kindness, when it appeared, tended to appear without announcement, in gestures no one was meant to see. On his own wedding morning, back in 1947, he had sent hot coffee out to the press pack, shivering in the cold on the pavement outside, the very press he would spend the next 70 years resenting. Long afterwards, when his son's marriage was collapsing in public, he wrote to the unhappy Princess of Wales a series of long, careful, typewritten letters, trying in his blunt way to help, signing himself with rough affection and admitting, with typical self-deprecation, that he had no talents whatsoever as a marriage counsellor. She, in her turn, addressed him warmly and told him his letters proved that he genuinely cared. Both things were true of him at the very same time, the barked correction and the private letter, the cold verdict and the quiet coffee. The staff held both halves of him and told neither, and that is precisely why the man remained. To the public that watched him for 70 years, only ever half known. Of all the people who held both halves of Philip at once, one man had held them longest and stood closest of all. And it was that man's story that would drag the private world of the household just once out into the pitiless public glare. To follow the code of silence to its single greatest test, the story turns now to the Australian friend who had known Philip since before the Crown, to a raffish Soho club, and to 4 months at sea that would put the whole marriage on trial in the eyes of the world. Chapter 8. The Friend Who Knew Too Much. One man had known Philip since before he was royal, drank with him in a Soho club, ran his office, and stood closer to the marriage than anyone outside it. Michael Parker had been there almost from the beginning of the adult story. Born in Melbourne in 1920, an Australian naval officer, he had met Philip in 1942, when both were young men in command of small escort ships in the grey and lethal northern seas, nursing convoys through waters full of submarines. They had become friends in the particular permanent way that men at war become friends, quickly, completely, and without any pretense, tested by real danger and bonded by it. It was, above all, a friendship of equals, formed before either of them was anything grander than a junior officer, and that foundation was the key to everything that came after. Parker did not serve Philip because Philip was a prince. He served him because they were friends, and the Crown, and all the distance it might have put between them, came only later. After the wedding of 1947, Parker joined the household, first as equerry in waiting, and then, as the reign began, as private secretary. In practice, he was far more than any title suggested. He ran Philip's office, organised the tours, managed the diary, and functioned as companion, fixer, sounding board, and confidant all at once. When Elizabeth became queen and Philip found himself trapped in the empty, purposeless consort role, it was Parker who was closest to him through the very worst of the adjustment. Parker, who understood the frustration in his bones because he had known the man before the gilding. Parker, who could puncture the black moods and make him laugh. Of all the witnesses to Prince Philip's inner life in those early years of the reign, none stood nearer than the cheerful, worldly Australian who had come up out of the war at his side. Parker was also the presiding spirit of the one part of Philip's life that the newspapers most wanted to see and least understood, a men's luncheon club that gathered every Thursday. It met at a fish restaurant called Wheeler's on Old Compton Street in the heart of Soho, and it had been founded by a fashionable society photographer known to everyone simply as Baron, a man named Baron Nahum, who had taken the official photographs at the royal wedding. The Thursday Club was a loud, all-male, high-spirited affair, a weekly escape into good food, strong drink, and sharp and irreverent company. Its regulars over the years were the bright, worldly names of the day, well-known actors of stage and screen, a celebrated harmonica player, newspapermen and writers, the sort of quick-witted, unstuffy crowd that Philip, boxed in by protocol for the rest of the week, found an enormous relief to be among. It was the one place, perhaps, where he could be simply a clever, funny man among other clever, funny men, rather than a prince to be bowed to. That was its whole value to him, and it was also, precisely, its danger, because a prince who slips his guard and relaxes among such company is a prince about whom stories can later be told. There was nothing ever proven against the club beyond high spirits and late lunches, but its very existence, a prince of the blood slipping away to a Soho restaurant to lunch with a photographer, and a circle of worldly men was exactly the sort of thing that could, in the wrong hands, be made to look like almost anything, and in time it would be made to look like a great deal. There was, buried in that world, one earlier episode that the rumour mill would return to for decades. In 1948, while Princess Elizabeth was pregnant with their first child, Philip had been taken by Baron to meet a glamorous stage actress, and the two had dined and danced together on an evening out. Nothing was ever shown to have happened beyond that. The actress herself denied any affair, firmly, for the whole of the rest of her life, and complained bitterly that the innuendo had shadowed and damaged her career for no reason. She once remarked, with real weariness, that she would have led a far happier and easier life if the Duke, instead of coming uninvited to her dressing room, had simply gone home to his pregnant wife that night. It was gossip, and it stayed gossip, unproven then and unproven now. But it was the first thread of a story about Philip and secret women, and the Thursday Club world was where that thread had been spun. For now, though, the club was simply where Philip went to breathe, and Parker was the hinge between that private world and the palace, the one man who moved easily in both, who knew where the prince went on a Thursday and exactly why he needed to go. He was, in every sense, the keeper of the household's secrets, because he was standing inside all of them at once. If any single person embodied the theme this whole story circles, the extraordinary closeness of the trusted servant to the guarded man, it was Michael Parker in the early 1950s. He had a degree of access to Philip that no one outside the marriage itself could come near. He knew the moods and the frustrations, the escapes and the friendships and the griefs. He held all of it, and he was utterly trusted to hold it, which is exactly what made the coming years so dangerous. Because a man who holds every one of another man's secrets is also a man whose own life, if it should ever go badly and publicly wrong, can drag those secrets out into the light behind it. And Michael Parker's life, quietly, out of sight, was about to go very badly and very publicly wrong indeed. His marriage was failing. His wife, Eileen, worn down by the years in which her husband's entire existence had been given over to Philip, to the household, to the endless tours and the long absences, was reaching the end of her patience. The trouble was building at home, even as Parker prepared, once again, to leave home. The occasion for the leaving was a voyage, and it was no ordinary one. In the autumn of 1956, Philip set out on an extraordinary solo journey, a tour that would carry him away from Britain, from the Queen, and from his two young children for the better part of 4 months. He would travel aboard the royal yacht Britannia, the new floating home and symbol of the monarchy, on a route that would circle half the world and reach places no member of the royal family had ever set foot. Parker went with him, as private secretary and companion, as he always did, leaving his own crumbling marriage behind him in London. To Philip, the voyage was a gift, a rare chance to do genuine, useful work, to open a great sporting event on the far side of the earth, to visit the most distant corners of the Commonwealth and the loneliest outposts of empire, and to cross into the Antarctic itself. It was, in truth, the nearest thing to a naval command he would ever have again. Long months at sea with a real purpose, on a fine ship, moving. But a young husband sailing off from his wife and his small children for 4 months, in the very middle of the 1950s, when his marriage was already the object of ceaseless public fascination, was a story simply waiting for someone to write it. And on the other side of the world, in London, the marriage of the man standing at his shoulder was falling quietly to pieces. The two things, the long and conspicuous absence and the private domestic collapse, were about to crash together in the newspapers of 2 continents at once. And that collision would produce the single greatest test the household's code of silence ever faced. What they saw never left the corridors. But in the winter of 1957, for the first and very nearly the last time in 70 years, the corridors were about to be forced wide open. Chapter 9. 40,000 miles from home. In the autumn of 1956, Philip sailed away from his wife and his children for 4 months, and the distance began to talk. The voyage was vast, one of the longest and strangest journeys ever undertaken by any member of the royal family, and it is worth following its route, because the sheer scale of the absence is the raw material from which the whole scandal was later built. The royal yacht Britannia had sailed from Portsmouth in August, running down the length of Africa, and Philip flew out to join her in the middle of October, boarding at Mombasa on the coast of Kenya. From there, the yacht carried him across some 40,000 miles of open ocean, out to the very far edges of the Commonwealth and beyond them, on a route that would keep him at sea, on and off, until the following February. There was real and serious purpose to the journey. The centrepiece was Australia, where on the 22nd of November, 1956, Philip opened the Olympic Games in Melbourne, arriving at the great cricket ground in naval uniform to declare the Games of that year begun before a packed and cheering stadium. It was, for the young consort, a genuine moment of standing in for the crown on the world stage, and he carried it off with ease. From Melbourne, he made a flying visit to New Zealand, coming down out of the sky to be greeted by crowds, touring the towns, before rejoining Britannia to sail on southward. And then the voyage turned towards the strangest and most remarkable leg of the whole enterprise. The yacht sailed south, and then south again, down into the cold and empty latitudes at the very bottom of the world. And at the end of December 1956, Philip crossed the Antarctic Circle, becoming the first member of the British royal family ever to do so. He transferred, for part of it, from the royal yacht to a small survey ship working the ice, trading the comfort of Britannia for something far closer to the hard sea life he had given up when the crown came, and by every account he relished the exchange. Here was no ceremony and no crowd, only weather and ice and men doing a difficult job well, exactly the conditions in which he had always been most at ease. He went ashore among the ice and the survey stations, into a white and howling silence utterly unlike anything a consort's diary had ever before contained. New Zealand had received him as a conquering hero, the crowds pressing in at every stop, and for a few bright weeks the tour had the feel of a triumph. But between the ceremonies and the cheering, there were the long, empty stretches at sea, days and then weeks of grey water and routine. And it was in those stretches that a man's absence from his family is felt most sharply, both by him and by those he has left behind. At home in England, 2 small children were growing through months of their lives without their father. A young queen was carrying the whole weight of a new reign without her husband at her side. And the distance, mile after mile of it, kept lengthening, until by the turn of the year, the yacht was as far from London as it was possible for a ship to be, down among the ice at the bottom of the world. The southern leg gave him one of the few genuinely private and moving moments of the whole long journey. In early January of 1957, at a bleak whaling station called Grytviken on the storm-battered island of South Georgia, Philip stood at the grave of Ernest Shackleton, the great Antarctic explorer who had died there decades before and been buried at the very end of the earth. It is not hard to see why the place spoke so directly to him. Shackleton was everything Philip most admired in a man, a leader in the last extremity, practical, brave, resourceful, and entirely unsentimental, who had brought every one of his people home alive through the impossible by sheer competence and iron will. A man who prized those qualities above all others in the world had travelled to the ends of the earth and found, in a frozen graveyard beside a whaling station, a kind of hero to stand beside in the cold. From there, the long road home began, up through the loneliest specks of land in the whole South Atlantic, Tristan da Cunha, St. Helena, Ascension Island, and on at last, towards Europe and home. For Philip, all of it was the closest thing to happiness his strange, hemmed-in role ever allowed him. Long months at sea on a fine ship, doing real work among real men, moving with a genuine purpose, out at last from under the crushing weight of the palace and the court. But that, unfortunately, is not at all how it looked from home. From London, and from the newspaper offices of 2 continents, the picture was entirely different and far darker. Here was a young husband, not yet 36 years of age, who had chosen, apparently freely, to spend 4 whole months at the far side of the world, away from his wife and his 2 small children, sailing from party to port and ceremony to ceremony in the cheerful company of a circle of men. In an age hungry for royal drama, and around a marriage already watched with an obsessive and possessive attention, the very length of the absence became the story. Why? The whisper went, spreading from dinner table to gossip column. Would any man leave his young family for so long, unless there was something at home he wished very much to be away from, or something abroad he wished very much to be near? There was, in sober truth, nothing whatever in the voyage itself but hard work, changing weather, ceremony, and the long ordered routines of a ship at sea. But a rumour does not need fuel of that kind. It needs only distance and time, and the voyage supplied both in overflowing abundance. 4 months is a very long time for a silence to grow loud in. And into that lengthening silence, in the first raw weeks of 1957, there fell a single piece of news that gave the vague and formless whisper exactly the hard shape it had been searching for. The news concerned not Philip at all, but the man standing loyally at his side. Michael Parker's marriage, back home in London, had finally and completely collapsed, and it had collapsed in the very worst possible way, in public, with solicitors and separation and headlines, at the precise moment the yacht was turning at last for home. Weigh the scale of the thing, because the contrast between the achievement and the scandal is almost cruel. A voyage of some 40,000 miles, roughly 4 months away from home. The opening of an Olympic Games watched by the whole world. The first crossing of the Antarctic Circle by any British royal in history. A pilgrimage across the ice to the grave of Shackleton at the bottom of the earth. By any fair measure, it was one of the most ambitious and successful journeys the modern monarchy had ever mounted, a genuine feat of endurance and duty. And every mile of it, every ceremony, and every handshake and every crossing, was about to be swallowed whole, in the public mind, by a single ugly word. Rift. The papers had already decided that the real story of the great voyage was not where Philip had gone, or what he had done. The real story, they had decided, was what his going had secretly meant. And the household, still 4 months out at sea, was sailing home straight into a storm that no amount of seamanship could ever steer them through. Chapter 10. The divorce that reached the yacht. As the yacht turned for home, the marriage of the man running Philip's household collapsed in the London papers, and he resigned at Gibraltar to spare the palace. The exact sequence of those few February days in 1957 is worth setting out slowly and carefully, because it is the precise moment at which the private world of the household broke the surface into full public view, and because the hard facts of it are clear and specific, while the rumours that swarmed around it were neither. On the 5th of February, 1957, in London, Eileen Parker, Michael Parker's wife and the mother of his 2 children, announced through her solicitor that she and her husband were to separate. The marriage had been in real difficulty for a very long time, ground down by the years in which Parker's entire life, his time, his attention, his loyalty, had been given over almost completely to Philip, to the household, to the endless tours and the long repeated absences of which this 4-month voyage was only the latest and the longest. Now, with her husband once again on the very far side of the world, she had at last reached the end of her endurance, and she made the break public and formal. She would in time write her own account of those years, a memoir of her life inside the royal household, so she was not, in the end, entirely silent. But in that first week of February, the plain fact that mattered was stark and simple. The private secretary to the Duke of Edinburgh was now, suddenly and publicly, the central figure in a marriage scandal. Parker learned of it as Britannia neared the final leg of the long voyage home, and he understood at once, completely, what it meant. A royal household in the 1950s could not carry a public divorce at its very heart. Not in a Britain where such things still ended careers, closed doors, and barred a man from polite society. For Parker to stay in his post would be to drag the palace itself into the scandal, to hand the hungry newspapers a bright thread that led directly from his own broken marriage into the private life of the prince he had served since the war. So he did the honourable thing, which was, in truth, the only thing a man of his particular code could do. On the 6th of February, 1957, at Gibraltar, as the yacht made its final approach to home waters, Michael Parker resigned as private secretary to the Duke of Edinburgh. He stepped down deliberately, to spare the palace the embarrassment, to carry the scandal away with him as he went, and to protect, with his resignation, the man and the institution he had given his working life to. A photograph survives from that grey day at Gibraltar, the two men together for the last time in the old way, and the caption beneath it records the plain and melancholy fact of it, that Parker resigned following the announcement of his wife's separation, and that the two of them said their goodbyes and then went their separate ways. It is a very quiet ending to the closest friendship of the whole early reign. The man who had known Philip since the dark days of the war, who had run his office and stood at his shoulder through the hardest years of the adjustment to the empty consort role, who had been the keeper of all his private world, walked away from the household in order to protect it, and the great door closed softly behind him. Parker's own account of how Philip took the blow is one of the very few first-hand glimpses anyone has into the Duke's private feelings in that hour, and it is deeply telling. Philip, Parker said afterwards, was incandescent, very, very angry, and deeply hurt. Read those 3 descriptions carefully, because the anger was not directed at Parker at all. It was directed at the newspapers, at the whole ravenous machinery of publicity that had taken a man's private grief and his failing marriage and turned them into a public scandal that cost him his position, his standing, and his place at his friend's side. Philip was losing, in a single stroke, the one companion in the world who understood him best, and he was losing him directly to the force he hated and distrusted above all others on earth, the press. The hurt in him was real and lasting. So was the fury, and neither of them could change by an inch what was happening. The friendship itself became a casualty of the very same public glare that the entire household existed to hold at bay. There is a wider truth buried in the wreck of the Parker marriage, and it is one the household knew better than anyone. Service to Prince Philip, and to the crown through him, was a jealous master that consumed the lives around it. Eileen Parker had married a naval officer and found herself instead the neglected wife of a courtier, a woman raising 2 young children, a son and a daughter, while her husband gave his every waking hour and every long absence to another man's diary. The tours, the voyages, the late nights, the total devotion the role demanded, all of it fell as a shadow across the home. Years afterward, Eileen would set down her own account of those years inside the royal household in a book of her own, one of the very few first-hand records ever written from that inner world, and it is a quiet testimony to the price the household exacted from the families of the men who served it. Michael Parker was not the last of Philip's men whose marriage would strain under the weight of the work. He was simply the one whose strain broke into the newspapers at the worst possible moment. It is important to be exact about the timeline here, because it has been badly blurred in the retelling over the years. The separation was announced in early February of 1957. The resignation followed within a day of it, at Gibraltar. The actual divorce, the legal decree itself, did not come until well over a year later, in 1958, when it was granted to Eileen Parker on the grounds of her husband's adultery, with another woman named in the court papers as the cause. The scandal, in other words, unfolded in two quite separate stages. The public separation first, in the winter of 1957, and the legal divorce more than a year afterwards. But in the fevered, overheated atmosphere of February 1957, such careful distinctions were entirely lost. What the public saw was simpler, cruder, and far more lurid than the truth. The Duke of Edinburgh's closest aide, his chosen companion on a 4-month voyage away from the Queen, had just become the central figure in a divorce. And in the mind of a scandal-hungry press, one question followed from that fact with a terrible and unfair ease. If the private secretary, then why not the prince? If Parker's marriage had cracked apart out there in that world of clubs and voyages and easy male companionship, then what? The papers wondered aloud of the master he had served so closely. It was an unfair leap, entirely unsupported by any evidence whatsoever, but it was precisely the leap the newspapers now made. And now, a second dark thread twisted itself around the first. It was no longer enough, for the hungriest of the press, that Parker was divorcing. The story they truly wanted, the one that would sell papers on 2 continents, was that the divorce was merely a symptom, that the whole long conspicuous absence and the whole raffish, clubbable world around it pointed to trouble in the one royal marriage the entire public cared about above all others. Within days, that far more dangerous story appeared in cold print. And when it did, Buckingham Palace was forced into an act almost without precedent in its long history. An act that broke its own oldest and most sacred rule of all. Chapter 11. The rumour the palace had to answer. A newspaper printed a rumour that Buckingham Palace, by its own iron rule, should never have dignified with a single word. And then the palace answered it. The rumour surfaced first in the American press, where the deep reverence that still surrounded the British monarchy at home carried far less weight and imposed far less restraint. A newspaper in Baltimore ran the story under a headline that spoke, in so many words, of the Queen and the Duke being in a rift over a party girl. The report claimed there were rumours of Philip's interest in an unnamed woman, whom he was said to have met regularly at the West End apartment of a society photographer. No woman was named in it. No photographer was named in it. No evidence of any kind was offered for any of it. It was rumour, printed openly as rumour, dressed up in the breathless language of scandal, and released into a world only too eager and too ready to believe the very worst. It is absolutely essential to be clear, here of all places, about what this was and what it was not, because the whole moral centre of the story rests on the distinction. It was not the exposure of an affair. No affair was ever established, then or in all the years since. There was no named woman, because no woman was ever produced or identified. There was no evidence, because none existed to be found. What there was, and all there was a whisper, given the false shape and borrowed weight of a printed newspaper story, feeding hungrily on the raw, circumstantial material of a 4-month absence and a private secretary's very public divorce. The rumour was entirely real. The affair was not. A newspaper printed a rumour, and that is a documented fact. What the rumour alleged was never once shown to be true, and that is a fact of exactly equal weight, and it must never be allowed to blur into the other. But once the story was in cold print and spreading fast from paper to paper, the palace faced a problem it almost never had to face. Its most ancient rule, the rule that had governed its dealings with the press for generations upon generations, was simplicity itself. The palace does not comment on rumour. It does not confirm. It does not deny. It does not engage. It does not so much as acknowledge. To respond to a rumour by this iron logic is to grant the rumour life, to admit it into the realm of things serious enough to be worth discussing at all. And so the standard course, the course of 100 years and more, would have been an absolute and stony silence. Say nothing. Let it burn itself out for want of fuel. But this particular rumour was different, and dangerously so, because it struck not at some peripheral or trivial matter, but at the very heart of the whole institution, at the soundness and the fidelity of the sovereign's own marriage, and it was spreading quickly enough that silence itself was beginning to look like something far worse than any denial. Silence in this one case was beginning to look like a confession. It mattered a great deal, too, where the story had started. Had it appeared first in a British paper, the old deference might have smothered it. But it had come out of the American press, 3,000 miles away and quite beyond the reach of the palace's usual quiet controls, in a country that regarded the British monarchy as fascinating public property, rather than as something to be handled with reverence. From there, it could spread back across the Atlantic with a life of its own, and the palace could no longer simply lean on a few trusted editors to let it die. The rumour had escaped the small, deferential world in which such things had always before been managed. That was new, and it was frightening, and it forced a new kind of response. So the palace broke its own rule. Through the Queen's press secretary, a former naval man named Commander Richard Colville, known throughout Fleet Street with a kind of rueful, exasperated respect as the abominable No Man, for his flat, unyielding refusal to tell any journalist anything at all, Buckingham Palace issued a formal statement. It was very short. It is quite untrue, the statement said, that there is any rift between the Queen and the Duke. A single flat sentence, and it made headlines right around the world, precisely and entirely, because everyone who read it understood at once what its mere existence meant. They meant that the situation had grown grave enough that the palace, the institution that famously never, ever spoke, had judged it necessary to speak. For a monarchy built on centuries of dignified silence to come out and deny a rumour on the record was itself an extraordinary event, a public admission that the whisper had grown too loud and too dangerous to be ignored any longer. The denial was, in its very existence, a precise measure of how threatening the moment had become. Philip's own view of the affair rumours, expressed later in life with his characteristic bluntness, cut straight through to the practical absurdity of the whole thing. "How on earth could I," he is reported to have said, "when I have had a detective in my company, night and day, since 1947? It is a revealing answer, and a genuinely persuasive one. A man in his exact position was quite simply never alone. He was watched, guarded, escorted, and accompanied every waking and sleeping hour of every single day by security officers, in a way that made the secret assignations of the rumour close to physically impossible in practice. The point lands hard, and it is fair. But underneath the practical rebuttal it also carries, quietly, the deeper truth of his entire life, that he lived under permanent and total observation, that ordinary privacy was something he had surrendered forever on the day he married, and that even the very accusation of a secret private life ran aground at once on the simple, crushing fact that he was never, ever, for 1 hour, unwatched. Here is the great and bitter irony sitting at the dead center of the man's whole story. Prince Philip was one of the most closely and constantly watched human beings alive on the earth, surrounded at every moment of the day and night by detectives, equerries, valets, and pages. And yet the inner truth of the man remained almost entirely hidden from the world, because every one of the people doing the watching was sworn, absolutely, to silence. He had no privacy at all, and total privacy, both at the very same time. Every hour of his life was witnessed. None of it was ever told. The rumour of 1957 was the single exception that proved just how tight the seal around him really was. A rare moment when the outside world, starved of any real information at all, simply invented a lurid story to fill the aching vacuum. And the palace was forced to step, just once, out of its silence in order to knock the invention down. The rumour did not, in the end, destroy the marriage, because there was nothing at all beneath it with which to destroy anything. What it did do was frighten the ancient institution badly enough to make it act, twice. And in the days that followed the unprecedented denial, as the yacht at long last brought Philip home to England, the Crown moved to do far more than merely deny the whisper through a press officer. It moved to answer the whisper, publicly, permanently, and unmistakably, with a single great gesture that no one in the watching world could possibly misread. The Queen was about to make her husband something that he had never been in all his life, and the precise timing of it would tell the watching world everything it could ever need to know about where the marriage truly stood. Chapter 12. The title that ended the whisper. Days after the reunion, the Queen did something that read, to a watching world, like an answer written in stone. Philip came home in the middle of February 1957. Britannia's enormous voyage ended at last, and husband and wife were reunited at Lisbon, in Portugal, on the 16th of February. There is a much-loved story attached to that reunion, and it deserves its place, because it is a small, human corrective to the whole vast edifice of the Rift scandal. Philip and his officers, in the long weeks at sea, had grown beards. The Queen, so the story goes, learning of this, arranged for the whole of the welcoming royal party aboard the aircraft that met them to greet the returning sailors while all wearing false beards, as a private family joke. Whether every single detail of it is exact hardly matters in the least. The spirit of the thing, a wife meeting her husband after 4 long months apart with a shared and silly private joke rather than with cold and wary formality, is the truest possible answer to everything the newspapers had spent that winter building. Whatever the papers had constructed out of distance and rumour, the two people at the actual centre of it behaved, in private, exactly like a couple who were simply and genuinely glad to see one another again. But a private gladness, however real, could not by itself answer a very public rumour. For that, something visible was needed, something solid and permanent that the whole world could read at a single glance. And on the 22nd of February 1957, just days after the reunion at Lisbon, it came. The Queen issued letters patent, a formal instrument of the Crown, granting her husband the style and titular dignity of a Prince of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. From that day forward he was, formally and for all time, His Royal Highness, the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. To modern ears it can sound like a dry technicality, a small adjustment in the endless fine print of royal heraldry and in the strict letter of the law that is more or less what it was. But its meaning, in that one particular and charged week, was impossible for anyone to miss. In the very days when half the world was whispering that the royal marriage was in crisis and perhaps in ruins, the sovereign herself chose to publicly and permanently elevate her husband, to grant him a great dignity in his own right, and to place him more firmly, more visibly, and more unmistakably at the very centre of the crown than he had ever been before. To a watching world, it read as an answer written in stone. Not a denial issued at second hand through a press secretary, which could be picked over and argued with and discounted, but a formal act of state, permanent, deliberate, and entirely unmistakable, that said as loudly as any such thing can ever say anything at all, "This is my husband, and he stands here at the very heart of this monarchy by my own hand, and there is no rift here for anyone to find." The timing of it was surely deliberate, a great public gesture of solidarity offered at the exact moment it was most needed. A wife answering a slander not with words, but with an honour. It is only fair to add the careful caveat that the honesty of this story genuinely requires that the idea of making Philip a prince in his own right had in fact been discussed before the crisis ever broke, that it carried its own quite separate constitutional logic, that the Prime Minister of the day had steered the palace towards this particular United Kingdom form of the title rather than a broader one, and so the precise timing may have been in part a matter of chance and circumstance rather than pure design. But very few of those who watched it happen at the time read it as chance. They read it, correctly, as the crown itself closing ranks, firmly and publicly, around one of its own. And that, in the end, is the deepest meaning of the whole episode for the story of the household and its silence. The rumour had forced the private world violently into the open. The unprecedented denial had cracked the palace's ancient silence. And now, the title, the act of state, sealed the breach and drew the silence back over everything, more firmly and more completely than ever before. The lesson of it was absorbed at every single level of the institution, from the Queen down to the newest footman. The private world would be defended, whatever it took. The public face would be presented, united, dignified, and correct, whatever the private reality. And the people who actually knew what went on inside, the equerries and the secretaries and the valets and the pages, would say nothing at all, now and forever, because they had just watched with their own eyes exactly what happened when the seal was broken, and they had watched the crown itself move heaven and earth to close it again. Michael Parker, the man who had been the closest witness of all, was gone. His place inside the household was ended forever, and the closest friendship of the early reign was over as suddenly as the storm that had broken it. He had taken the scandal away with him when he went, exactly as he had meant to do, and the great machine simply closed over the gap that he left. New men came in to run the office, to carry the diary, to stand at the shoulder, to guard the private hours. The household reformed itself around the Duke and went on, disciplined, loyal, and utterly mute, very nearly as though the storm of 1957 had never once blown through it at all. The public would remember, if it remembered anything of the affair, only that there had been some fuss, long ago, about a voyage and a divorce, and that the palace had said, once, that it was nothing. Weigh the full measure of what that single winter had cost and had contained, because it is remarkable. 4 months at sea, and 40,000 miles of ocean. One private secretary's marriage ended in the newspapers of 2 continents. One quiet, honourable resignation at Gibraltar, offered up to protect the crown. One rumour of an affair that was never once proven and never would be. One unprecedented denial, a single flat sentence, wrung out of a palace that never spoke. One reunion at Lisbon, and one gentle joke with false beards, and one letters patent, one great and permanent act of state that made a stateless boy from a fruit box on a Greek island into a prince of the United Kingdom, and told the entire watching world that this marriage would endure. It endured in the end for another 64 years, until death alone finally parted them. And every one of the men who had watched every hour of the crisis from the inside kept their silence about all of it, each and every one of them faithfully to the grave. The great test of the household's code of silence had come and had gone, and the code had held. What remained was the long, quiet work of a lifetime, the decades in which a slowly rotating cast of servants would come to know Prince Philip as no one outside his own family ever could, would serve him faithfully through age and retirement and the slow, sad narrowing of his world, and would, at the very end of it all, be remembered by him and yet left standing outside his own chapel door. To measure what that long loyalty was truly worth, and what it quietly cost the men who gave it, the story turns now to the ones who stayed. Chapter 13. The men who stayed 30 years. After Parker came a line of men who served Philip for decades and left almost nothing at all on the record, and that near total silence was precisely the point. Where the Australian friend had burned bright and fallen fast and public, the private secretaries who came after him were of an entirely different mould, men who arrived, served faithfully for many years, and left again in silence. Their loyalty measured not in memoirs and interviews, but in the sheer length of their service, and in the honours quietly pinned to their names. They are not famous men. They were never meant to be. And it is exactly their obscurity, their determined refusal ever to become a story, that tells you how completely the whole household had learned and absorbed the hard lesson of 1957. Consider the role of them, one by one, because the pattern is the point. There was Sir Brian McGrath, a man of the wine trade and the Irish Guards, and a master of wine by profession, who joined the Duke's office in the early 1980s, and then stayed, in one role or another, for more than 30 years, first as private secretary and treasurer, then as head of the whole household, and then on as an extra equerry into his own old age. 3 decades at the side of one man, and scarcely a public word from him in all of it. There was Brigadier Sir Miles Hunt Davis, a career soldier who had commanded Gurkhas in the field, who ran Philip's office as private secretary for some 17 years, from the early 1990s through to the year 2010, and who was widely regarded as the single most trusted aide of the Duke's later working life. 17 years at the elbow of the most quotable man in the royal family, and almost nothing on the record. And there was the last of the line, Brigadier Archie Miller Bakewell, a former officer of the Blues and Royals, who took over the private secretaryship in 2010 and served without interruption until the very end, through the retirement and down into the final illness, more than a decade at the helm of a steadily shrinking household. Around and beneath these senior men stood the rest of the inner household, the people whose names almost never reached a newspaper at all. There were the correspondence secretaries who handled the endless flood of his letters. There were the assistant private secretaries who deputized and organized. There was an archivist and librarian who kept his papers and his enormous personal library in order. There were the valets and the pages, changing across the years, who dressed him and attended him and stood near enough to hear everything and repeat nothing. Together, they made up a small, close, self-contained world, a household in the old and complete sense of the word. And the striking thing about that world is how few of its members ever became known to the public at all. They were, by design and by discipline, invisible. The whole machinery was built to be unseen, so that the man at its center could be seen exactly as he chose to be, and no other way. What is genuinely striking about these men, beyond the sheer length of their service, is exactly how that loyalty was recognized and rewarded. The honours climbed in careful step with the years. The Royal Victorian Order, the particular decoration that is the personal gift of the sovereign for personal service to the crown, was bestowed and then advanced, grade by grade, upon these servants as their tenure lengthened, until men like Magrath and Hunt Davis held its very highest ranks, knighthoods and grand crosses, given not by the government, but by the monarch's own hand. The contrast with the wider world of royal service could hardly have been sharper, and it grew sharper still as the decades passed. All around the monarchy, over these same years, the old code of discretion was breaking down. Servants of other households, of other royal figures, began to talk, to sell their memories, to write the tell-all books that a hungry press and a hungry publishing trade would pay well for. The private lives of the royal family became, by the 1980s and 90s, one of the most profitable subjects in the country, and there was no shortage of former footmen and nannies and protection officers willing to supply the market. And yet, through all of it, from the household of Prince Philip, there came almost nothing. The men who had stood closest to one of the most talked about families on earth, who had seen the temper and the rows and the private griefs at first hand, simply did not speak. Whatever they had been offered, whatever the market would have paid, they kept the door shut. This was the machinery of the household's silence made visible for anyone who cared to read it. Discretion and length of loyal service were recognized, honored, and made permanent, in a way that talking to a newspaper never could be and never would be. To serve long and to say nothing was the whole of the unwritten contract, and the reward for keeping it was a place in the sovereign's own order of chivalry, and a set of letters after your name that marked you, quietly and for life, as one of the crown's own trusted and honoured people. But the loyalty was never merely bought with ribbons and honours, and this is the part that the cold caricature of Prince Philip always misses entirely. The men who served him did not simply grit their teeth and endure him for the sake of a knighthood at the end. They were, by their own testimony, wherever any survives, genuinely devoted to him. A royal butler who watched the Duke at close quarters across many years gave perhaps the clearest account anyone has ever given of why that should be so. People were nervous of him, the butler freely admitted. He was blunt. He was not to everyone's taste. And then, without a moment's hesitation, the very same man said that he had adored Prince Philip, that he had liked precisely the fact that the Duke never suffered fools and always, without fail, said exactly what he thought. The bluntness that so frightened outsiders was, to the people who worked inside the household, a kind of bracing honesty that they came in time to prize above almost anything. You never once had to guess where you stood with him. He would not flatter you, and he would not lie to you, and for a certain kind of person, the kind who quietly values truth above comfort, that plain dealing was worth more than any amount of softer, warmer, emptier manners could ever have been. It made for a household bound together by something a great deal stronger than mere paid employment. These were men who had given the whole of the best part of their working lives to one demanding, brilliant, exhausting, and difficult man, and who had received in return not warmth exactly, and certainly not ease, but respect and honesty, and a place close to the very centre of great events. They knew him as almost no one else on earth ever did or ever would. They saw the temper, and they saw the tenderness, the exactitude, and the sudden unexpected flashes of kindness, the sharp verdicts and the quiet letters, the whole of the man that the public was only ever shown in careful, curated fragments. And they kept it. Across all of those long decades, from the fall of Michael Parker in 1957 right down to the last quiet years at Windsor, the household held its silence as if by pure instinct, a silence that had become, by then, part of the very identity and the deep pride of the place itself. So what, in all those long years of close and faithful service, did they actually see? The answer is the private life of a man who, once released from the ceremonial mask and the endless public duty, poured the whole of his restless, dammed-up energy into a set of consuming private passions that revealed the truth of him far better than any state occasion or official speech ever could. The staff did not merely witness those passions from a respectful distance. They enabled them, arranged them, provisioned them, and cleared up after them. And then they stood quietly back and watched while the Duke of Edinburgh, in the few precious hours that were genuinely and entirely his own, became at last most fully and most truly himself. And of all those private passions, the ones that tell you the very most about the real man are three: the workshop, the stable, and the open fire. Chapter 14: The Workshop and the Barbecue. The obsessions the staff quietly enabled reveal the man better than any speech ever could, from the carriage he engineered with his own hands to the hearse he spent 16 patient years building for himself. Prince Philip in private was a maker, a driver, a flyer, and a cook, a man who simply could not sit still and would not for a moment be idle, and the household organized itself, year after year, around the demanding pursuits that filled his rare and jealously guarded free hours. Each of those passions is a clean window into exactly the same character, the practical, exacting, restless, and fiercely self-reliant officer who had been forged on cold ships and colder shores, still hard at work in the quiet corners of a gilded royal life. Take the carriages first. When age forced him to give up playing polo, at around the age of 50, Philip did not simply retire gracefully from sport, as another man might have. Instead, he took up an entirely new and punishing one, almost from scratch: the demanding discipline of carriage driving, racing teams of horses harnessed to a light carriage across rough country and through hazards against the ticking clock. And he did not merely take part in it as a genteel royal amateur. He competed hard for his country and drove for the British national team. And then, being Philip, being always and forever the engineer, he set about improving the very equipment of the sport. He designed and introduced real innovations to the carriages themselves: a new kind of driving pole, better and stronger wheels, quick release fittings for the harness, some of which are still in everyday use in the sport to this day. It is the burning smoke float raft of 1943 all over again, the very same instinct that had once saved a destroyer in the dark, now turned upon a horse and a carriage on an English estate. He looked at a system, and he made it work better. He kept it up faithfully for many years, long after most men of his age and rank would have long since stopped. And he spoke of the simple, unqualified pleasure of driving a team of horses through the British countryside as one of the very few pure joys of his whole long life. His mastery of the sport went deep enough that he wrote about it. For a man famous for his blunt impatience with words, Prince Philip was, in private, a surprisingly prolific author, and over his life he wrote 14 books, several of them about carriage driving itself, setting down the technique and the judging and the sheer pleasure of it for the people who would come after him. It was of a piece with everything else about him, the wish not merely to do a thing, but to understand it completely, to master its system, and then to hand the mastery on. Then there was the air. Philip was a natural and gifted pilot who threw himself into flying with the same total, consuming commitment he brought to everything he loved, logging in the end nearly 6,000 hours in the air across some 59 different types of aircraft over the decades, everything from small fixed-wing planes to helicopters, until he finally gave it up in the late 1990s when he was already well into his 70s. The staff arranged the flights, and managed the endless logistics, and then they watched a man entirely in his element, at the controls, in sole command, in motion, precisely the way he had been happiest since his youngest days on the open bridge of a fighting ship. The scale of his private passions, counted up, is its own kind of portrait, and it is worth pausing on the numbers because they say more than any adjective could. Nearly 6,000 hours logged in the air across 59 different types of aircraft, a personal library that ran, by the time it was catalogued, to some 8,385 books, of which 373 were about horses alone. 14 books written with his own hand. Many years spent competing in carriage driving, well into old age, and 16 patient years given to the design of a single vehicle, his own hearse. This was not a man filling idle hours. This was a mind that could not stop working, that turned every free moment into a project, a study, a system to be mastered. And the household existed, in large part, to keep that ferocious private engine supplied with the things it needed. And then there was the fire, and the fire is perhaps the most revealing of all the passions, because it shows the private man at his most surprisingly human and domestic. At Balmoral, the family's great retreat in the Scottish Highlands, the central ritual of the whole summer was the outdoor barbecue, and the barbecue was Philip's own domain, absolutely and without rival. A royal chef who worked in the household kitchens for many years described the Duke, with real affection, as the most passionate of all cooks. A man who would walk the kitchen gardens himself, choosing the vegetables with his own eye, asking the staff what could be marinated and what was ready that day to be picked. At these cookouts, by the consistent accounts of those who witnessed them, the entire ordinary order of the palace was gently turned upside down. There were no footmen serving, no staff hovering at anyone's elbow, no ceremony of any kind. The Queen herself set out the table. The Duke did the cooking. The family divided the courses among themselves and waited on one another. And the servants, for that one evening, simply stood back, out of the way, and let the master of the house do the work with his own two hands over the hot coals in the open Highland air. The man who ran a palace like a warship spent some of his very happiest evenings as a cook at his own fire, waiting patiently on his own family rather than being waited upon by anyone. The engineer and the maker in him showed up even here, even at the fireside. He had, by one account from within the family itself, a special trailer purpose built to carry the whole of his barbecue equipment so that the entire apparatus could be hitched up, hauled out, and set up in the unlikeliest, wildest, and most beautiful spots on the estate. The barbecue on wheels is the perfect small emblem of the whole man, the relentless practical mind and the quiet private pleasure fused together into a single, carefully engineered, unshowy object. And that very same fusion of the coldly practical and the deeply personal produced, in the end, the strangest and the most quietly moving of all his private projects, the one that gathered up the entire character of the man into a single machine. For roughly the last 16 years of his life, beginning in the year 2003, when he was already comfortably past the age of 80, Prince Philip worked on and off, patiently, with the engineers of a British car maker, on one very particular and very personal commission. He was designing his own hearse. He took a Land Rover, a plain, tough, practical, working vehicle of exactly the kind he had driven around his own estates all his adult life, and he modified it, carefully and precisely, to carry his coffin at his own funeral. He had the colour changed to a deep, dark, military green, sober and entirely unshowy. He specified an open top at the rear, so that the coffin would be visible to the people who came to see him go. He designed the rubber grips that would hold it steady on its final journey. And he worked at it, adjusting and refining the details right into his late 90s, finishing off the last small alterations only a couple of years before he died. There is no more complete portrait of the man anywhere than this one object. Exacting, practical, entirely unsentimental, completely self-directed, planning his own last journey down to the very last fitting and rubber grip over 16 quiet and patient years in a workshop, with his own hands guiding the whole design. The boy who had once been carried out of Greece as a baby, asleep in a wooden fruit box he did not choose, would in the end leave the world in a vehicle that he had built, to the inch, entirely for himself. Chapter 15. The Last Small Household. When he finally stepped out of public life altogether, the great machine around him shrank away to a mere handful of men in a plain farmhouse where no one even wore a uniform. For 65 long years, Prince Philip had driven the largest working life that any royal consort in British history had ever undertaken. And then, in the spring of 2017, at the remarkable age of 95, he simply stopped. Buckingham Palace announced in the May of that year that the Duke would step back from public engagements from the autumn onwards. He had decided, entirely on his own terms and in his own time, exactly as he had done everything else, that the work at last was done and that it was time to lay it down. He gave the watching public one last perfect look at the man before he went. His final solo official engagement came on the 2nd of August, 2017, when he stood alone on the great forecourt of Buckingham Palace to meet a group of Royal Marines who had just completed a grueling charity endurance challenge. It was pouring with cold rain that day. He stood out in it regardless, 96 years old, the rain running steadily down his coat, entirely and serenely unbothered by any of it. And when he was told of the extraordinary physical hardships the men before him had willingly endured, he delivered one final public verdict in the purest and most unmistakable possible Philip idiom. "You should all be locked up," he told them, dry as dust. It was the very last thing the working prince said to the world in an official capacity after 22,000 engagements and 65 years, and it was somehow perfect, dry, funny, unsentimental, entirely without self-pity or ceremony. The exact same voice the staff had known and served for 70 years, delivered in the rain and then gone. And then the great machine of his enormous public life simply, quietly, shrank away almost to nothing. He retired in the main to Wood Farm, a modest 5-bedroom house on the Sandringham estate out in the flat Norfolk countryside. It was a plain and simple place, a genuine working farmhouse rather than any kind of palace. And by the accounts that survive of those years, the small staff who looked after him there did not even trouble to wear their uniforms. After a whole lifetime lived at the very centre of the largest and grandest household in the entire country, Prince Philip chose deliberately to end his days in something very close to ordinary simplicity, with only a small circle of trusted people around him, reading, painting in watercolours, writing his letters, and receiving the occasional quiet visit from the Queen, who would come to stay with him whenever her own unending duties allowed her to. The country that had watched him closely for 7 decades very largely lost sight of him in these last years, and by every sign that suited him entirely and completely. Behind him, as he withdrew, lay a legacy that reached far beyond the palace walls and the estates. The youth scheme he had founded back in 1956, the Duke of Edinburgh's Award, had grown across the decades into something vast, carrying his name and his boyhood creed of challenge and service and endurance to millions of young people in scores of countries around the world. It was, in the end, the most enduring thing he ever built, and it was the purest possible expression of the man. A direct transplant of the cold showers and the hill runs of Gordonstown into a program that any ordinary young person of any background could take up and be changed by. The stateless boy who had been shaped by a refugee schoolmaster had, in his turn, shaped the lives of generations he would never meet. And now, his own long work finished, he laid it all down and went quietly to the farmhouse in Norfolk to end his days. The household that cared for him through these final years was tiny beyond all comparison with the vast apparatus of his prime. And it is here, in this last small circle, that the whole long story of loyalty and silence reaches its quiet and its deeply human center. In his final years, his personal daily care fell chiefly to a small handful of men who took it in turns to attend him, at Wood Farm and later back at Windsor. There was his private secretary, the brigadier who had run his diary and his affairs for a decade and more. There was his page, and there was his valet. These were the men who were physically closest to him at the very end of his life, who helped him through each of his days, who were there with him all through the long isolation of the pandemic, when the whole outside world was shut firmly away, and the little household drew in tight and protective around the old man. They were, in the most complete and literal sense possible, the last of all his witnesses. And when the time came for him to set his affairs in final order, he did not forget a single one of them. Prince Philip's will, when its outline became public knowledge after his death, revealed that his estate, reported at somewhere around £30 million, made specific bequests to 3 of his long-serving personal staff: his private secretary, his page, his valet. The 3 men who had cared for him most closely in his final years were each remembered by name, provided for, and thanked in the one plain language that leaves a permanent and unarguable record behind it. For a man the wider world had always thought of as gruff, cold, and unsentimental, it was a profoundly and quietly telling act. He had spent the whole of his life valuing loyalty and competence above almost every other quality a person could possess, and at the very end of it, he reached back deliberately and rewarded exactly those 2 things, loyalty and competence, in the people who had given them to him without stint for years. The loyalty, it turned out, had been running steadily in both directions all along. The servants had given him their silence and their faithful service for decades on end, and he gave them back, in his will, in his own hand, the plain and permanent acknowledgement that he had seen it, that he had valued it, and that he would not let it pass from the world unmarked. It is the necessary counterpoint to everything hard and sharp in the man, and it deserves its full weight in the reckoning of him. The temper was real. The impatience was real. The barked corrections, and the walking away mid-sentence, and the cold, flat verdicts were every one of them real. And so, just as real, was this. A dying man, carefully ordering his estate, choosing to remember by name the page who had helped him to dress each morning, and the valet who had cared for his failing body, and the secretary who had run his days, setting all 3 of their names down deliberately in the one document that would outlast him. Whatever else Prince Philip was, and he was a great many difficult things, he was not, in the end, a man who forgot the people who had served him well. There was to be one final scene, though, one last great gathering of the family and the household, and it would deliver up the whole meaning of this long story in a single, quiet, and almost unbearable image. Because when Prince Philip at last died, and the household that he had bound so tightly to himself for a lifetime came together to say its last goodbye to him, the men who had been closest of all to him, the very men he had just remembered by name in his own will, would discover that there was, quite literally and quite simply, no room left for them inside the church. Chapter 16. 30 inside, the rest at the door. On the 17th of April, 2021, the men who had run his life for decades followed his coffin through the castle grounds, and then they stopped at the chapel door. Prince Philip had died 8 days earlier, on the 9th of April, 2021, in the morning at Windsor Castle. He was 99 years old, just 2 months short of his 100th birthday. He had been married to the Queen for 73 years, by far the longest-serving royal consort in the whole history of Britain. He died, by every account that survives, gently and without any drama at all, at home, with his wife near at hand, in very much the manner he would surely have chosen for himself. His daughter-in-law would later describe the passing in a few simple words that stayed with the whole grieving country, saying that it had been so gentle that it was just as if someone had quietly taken him by the hand and led him softly away. The funeral fell entirely under the long shadow of the pandemic, and that shadow shaped every single element of the day. In the ordinary course of things, the funeral of a man like Prince Philip would have filled St. George's Chapel to its walls with hundreds of mourners, with statesmen and crowned heads, and relatives and representatives gathered in from every corner of the earth, and the streets of Windsor outside would have been thick and deep with silent crowds. Instead, the strict rules that governed the whole locked-down country that spring allowed just 30 people, and no more, inside the chapel. 30. Households were kept rigidly apart from one another, seated at a cold distance across the empty pews, their faces covered. And so the single defining image of the entire day, the one that fixed itself permanently in the memory of a nation living through exactly the same isolation in its own homes, was the sight of the Queen herself sitting entirely alone, a small, solitary, black-clad figure in the vast and echoing space of the chapel, saying her last goodbye to the man who had stood faithfully beside her for 73 years, with no living soul permitted to sit close enough to comfort her. The service itself was full of him, built from beginning to end out of the plain materials of his own long life. The coffin was carried on the modified Land Rover hearse that he had spent 16 years designing for exactly this purpose, the deep green working vehicle he had engineered with his own hands, and there was something almost unbearably right in the sight of the old sailor and engineer making his very last journey aboard a machine of his own patient making. Royal Marine buglers sounded the old calls of the sea service he had loved above all others, the last post. And then, in a personal touch drawn straight up out of his wartime naval past, the piping call of action stations, the urgent summons that had once sent fighting men to their battle positions aboard a warship at sea. A lone piper played a lament that faded slowly away into silence as he walked. 8 Royal Marines bore the weight of the coffin on their shoulders. Around 730 members of the armed forces took part in the wider ceremonial that day, a full and formal military farewell to a man who had first gone to war at 19 and been mentioned in dispatches before he could vote. Every single element of it spoke, quietly and precisely, of the life, of the Navy, of the practicality, and of the lifelong refusal of any fuss. There was one detail of the guest list, among those precious 30 places, that spoke quietly of the very beginning of the story. 3 of the 30 were German princes, descendants of the sisters Philip had lost to history, the sisters who had married into German noble houses in the 1920s and moved away, and who had not been invited to his own wedding in the raw aftermath of the war. With space for only 30 mourners in all the world, the decision to give 3 of those places to the German family was read, by those who understood it, as a deliberate and gentle act of remembrance, a reaching back across a whole century to the scattered family of the boy from Corfu, the sisters, and the lost world that the long British life had been built on top of and had largely hidden. Even at the very end, the beginning was present in the room. And where, in the whole of this careful and moving ceremony, were the men who had actually served him, the private secretaries who had run his life for decades on end, the page who had helped him to dress each morning of his last years, the valet who had cared for his failing body right down to the very end, the three men he had remembered, just weeks before, by name, in his own will. They were there. Of course they were there. But they were not among the 30. With only 30 places to be had inside the chapel, and every single one of them rightly claimed by close family, there was simply no room left at all inside for servants, however close they had stood, however long they had served, however deeply they had been loved and trusted. And so they did the only thing that was left for them to do. They walked in the funeral procession, on foot, behind the coffin, through the grounds of the great castle, in the cold spring air, escorting their master on his final journey exactly as they had escorted him on 10,000 journeys before it. And at the chapel door, they stopped. The family passed inside. The servants remained without. They had watched him closely for a lifetime, and at the very last they stood and watched him go on through a door that they were not permitted to follow him through. There is the whole of the story, held complete in a single frame. Set the 30 against the faithful handful. Set the family gathered inside the warm chapel against the servants standing bareheaded at the cold door. Set the man who had no privacy at all, watched every waking hour of every day, against the very same man whose inner truth remained almost wholly hidden from the world, because every one of the watchers was sworn to eternal silence. Prince Philip had spent nearly a whole century in the closest possible company of people paid and pledged to reveal nothing of what they saw. And it had suited him completely and entirely, because he was a man who had learned, as a stateless and near-orphaned child, that the people who choose to look after you are the only true country a man ever really has, and who valued discretion, competence, and loyalty above nearly every softer thing in the world. The household was the one institution in all his life that he could truly command, and he had commanded it, in the end, into a silence so deep and so complete that even in his death it held fast. What they saw never left the corridors. He did not lie alone for long. He was placed first in the royal vault beneath the chapel, and when the Queen herself died the following year, after 70 years on the throne, the two of them were quietly brought together and laid side by side at last in a small side chapel at Windsor. The 73-year partnership closed and sealed. Years before, at a lunch marking their golden wedding, the Queen had tried, in her careful and undemonstrative way, to say in public what the man beside her had been to her across all the decades of the reign. "He is someone," she said, "who does not take easily to compliments, but he has, quite simply, been my strength and stay all these years." Strength and stay. It was as close as that most private of marriages ever came to a public declaration, and it was true. The man the world saw only as the figure one step behind had been, all along, the thing that held the centre steady. And the people who had watched him hold it, hour by hour, year by year, from the closest possible range, took what they knew of how he did it into their silence and kept it there. And that, finally, is not the failure of this story. That is the story. A life of total exposure to a small handful of people sworn to say nothing at all, lived deliberately and gladly by a man who wanted it, all of it, precisely and exactly that way. The one valet who wrote his gentle little book back in 1954 was the single exception across 70 years. All the rest of them kept the faith completely. The secretaries who served 30 years and said nothing. The page and the valet who cared for him to the last and said nothing. the men who followed his coffin to the chapel and stopped at the door and said nothing. Every one of them carried what they had seen out of the corridors of his long life and away into their own silence. And there, for the most part, it remains to this day, unspoken and unwritten. The boy who was carried out of one country as a baby, asleep in a wooden box he did not choose, was carried out of the world at last in a vehicle he had built entirely with his own hands, watched to the very end by the small band of people who had known him best in all the world and who would never, ever tell. Straight-backed, silent, correct. Exactly to the last, as he had always meant to be. If you would like more stories told from the quiet edge of great lives, the parts a household keeps to itself, then subscribe and stay with this channel, because there are many more of them to come. And I would very much like to hear from you on this one. If you had served a man like that for 30 years, and watched everything, and been sworn to say nothing at all, do you honestly think that you would have kept the code faithfully to the end? Or that you would have told what you saw? Leave your answer in the comments below, and tell me where you land.